Our guest today is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. He is a professor of medicine at Stanford University. Dr. Bhattacharya's research focuses on the economics of healthcare around the world, with a particular emphasis on the health and well-being of vulnerable populations. Doctor, very nice to have you. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here.
I want to delve into the Dr. Fauci, Senator Rand Paul exchange, which has gotten so much notoriety, gone viral, and so much attention. People are trying to interpret who's right and who's wrong, and we'll get into that momentarily. But in April, you were quoted in Newsweek magazine, and I want to read a quote back to you, first of all, to confirm its veracity, but also just to have you expound upon it. You said, and I quote, Dr. Fauci's actions during the epidemic have created the perception that he is a political actor. A significant portion of the country distrusts him and consequently mistrusts his advice. Much of the vaccine hesitancy in the country stems from this problem. Did you say that, and can you expound upon it?
I did say that. I think if you look at the way that Dr. Fauci has acted, and in his both his statements and also in sort of his body language, if you will. He has acted in ways that sort of unnecessarily criticized governors of red states like Florida that have had quite successful pandemic policies, and on the other hand, has gone out of his way not to criticize places where there's been deep failure in pandemic policy. For instance, New York and New Jersey, which have had the worst age-adjusted mortality in the whole epidemic from COVID. And so that has created, I think, a perception, a completely reasonable one, that Dr. Fauci is political. He also, I think, in his relationship with President Trump, with President Trump's advisor, Scott Atlas, also created this sort of sense of it wasn't just science. There was something political about how he was acting. And I think that's been quite unfortunate. Public health should not have that kind of political overlay. Public health has an obligation to speak to everybody and treat everybody with respect, no matter what your political leanings are.
You also said in that same Newsweek article, quote, I completely agree with Representative Jim Jordan of Ohio, that Dr. Fauci is utterly blind to the collateral damage from a lockdown, including our liberty, but also our other health needs.
I did say that, and I believe that completely. Dr. Fauci is the architect, if you will, of the lockdowns, or certainly the face of the lockdowns in the United States. The lockdowns include policies like keeping kids out of school, policies like closing businesses, and policies that essentially have stopped social life and economic life in the United States. And the problem is that if you think about it only from the point of view of disease control, you may think, okay, it might be a reasonable thing. Although I don't think actually it's worked very well, but that's another matter. But I don't think, I think to look and say that stop there ignores the consequences of the lockdown apart from disease control. Keeping kids out of school has an enormous consequence on their lives. Kids will leave shorter, poorer, sort of less fulfilling lives if they are kept out of school for even short periods of time. It turns out that's what the data say. That has consequences for their entire life. You close down hospitals to make sure that they're open for COVID patients, but then cancer patients don't come in. You get women who should have gotten screened for mammograms last year that are going to show up with stage 4 breast cancer this year, that would have been caught earlier and should have been caught earlier, that will die as a result. There's all kinds of health consequences that will happen and have happened as a consequence of the lockdowns, that mental health consequences as well. So and I have not seen Dr. Fauci address them. He basically seems to think about lockdowns as a costless strategy, as if disrupting social life and medical life, economic life in this way has no possibility, no harm.
Now, let's get into the exchange between Fauci and Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky just 3 days ago. The world is watching this. The world wants to know who's right. Let's play a clip of that right now.
Viruses that in nature only infect animals were manipulated in the Wuhan lab to gain the function of infecting humans. This research fits the definition of the research that the NIH said was subject to the pause in 2014 to 2017, a pause in funding on gain of function. But the NIH failed to recognize this, defines it away, and it never came under any scrutiny. Dr. Richard E. Bright, a molecular biologist from Rutgers, described this research in Wuhan as the Wuhan lab used NIH funding to construct novel chimeric SARS-related coronaviruses able to infect human cells and laboratory animals. This is high-risk research that creates new potential pandemic pathogens that exist only in the lab, not in nature. This research matches, these are Dr. E. Bright's words, this research matches, indeed epitomizes, the definition of gain-of-function research done entirely in Wuhan, for which there was supposed to be a federal pause. Dr. Fauci, knowing that it is a crime to lie to Congress, do you wish to retract your statement of May 11th where you claimed that the NIH never funded gain-of-function research in Wuhan?
Senator Paul, I have never lied before the Congress, and I do not retract that statement. This paper that you are referring to was judged by qualified staff up and down the chain as not being gain of function.
So
let me finish.
You take an animal virus and you increase its transmissibility to humans,
right.
You're saying that's not gain of function?
Yeah, that is correct. And Senator Paul, you do not know what you are talking about, quite frankly. And I want to say that officially. You do not know what you are talking about.
What's your reaction to that?
Okay, so a very quick history. In 2015, I think, or 14, the federal government decided that they were not going to fund gain of function. They're going to put a pause on gain of function research. Gain of function research, as the clip says, is research where you take a virus or some pathogen and you modify it in some way so that it gains the ability to do things it didn't previously. So, for instance, in this case, infect human cells in a lab, right? In a petri dish. We're not actually testing on actual humans. That's the classic definition of gain of function research. Now, what you see in this clip is Dr. Fauci saying, and one other key point there, that there were exceptions. If Dr. Fauci, as the head of the NIAID, decided that a experiment was worth doing, even if it met or didn't meet the definition of gain of function, he could give an exception to it, right? So they needed to go through Dr. Fauci and get permission, essentially, to do that. The scientists did. And so what he's saying is, look, I had my people at the NIH look at this and say it's okay. He signed off on it. Now, if he's relying on a technicality here, he's trying to say this is not gain of function in the way that the NIH meant it, but it's gain of function in the way that that motivated the pause in that research to begin with. Gain of function is potentially quite dangerous research, right? It might have, we don't know, might have resulted, the SARS virus itself might have resulted from such research. It was completely reasonable to do a pause. He could say, I mean, this is probably the honest truth, is that he could have said, look, I deem this kind of research worthwhile. There was arguments for that. He could have, because if you can learn that it just takes a couple of mutations to make a virus be able to infect human cells, that's worth knowing, and maybe you could do something about it. He could have said that. He said it was worth this was worth the risk. Instead, he's relying on a technical thing to sort of deny the obvious truth, which is this looks like, for all the world, like gain of function research, and then he signed off on it.
This is a really interesting point that you make in my mind, because it suggests to me another thing which is so common in our day and age, with sort of the gotcha moment under the bright lights of a televised congressional hearing, that people take their entrenched positions, both Paul, you could argue, and Dr. Fauci, and are so afraid of the extracted soundbite that will go viral that they can't respond in a calm, mannered fashion. Might that have played a role in this really heated exchange?
It was certainly, of course, they've had now a long history of sparring with each other. So that means I do think there's something to that. I mean, I think there are some nuances here. Right? There's a position that Dr. Fauci could take, and it's not an indefensible one. I mean, ex post, it looks like it could have been very, very dangerous, and it may have been the wrong decision ex post. But how was he to know at the time? And for Dr. Paul, he is saying a completely reasonable thing, right? He's saying, look, this looks like dangerous research. There was a pause at the time, and you've said okay to it, which is absolutely true. Mm-hmm. That's really the crux of it. Whether it's technically gain of function or not gain of function is not really the critical point here. The critical point is, did Dr. Fauci okay this research that looks for all the world like a very, it may be related, although we don't know for certain, to something that resulted in the SARS virus.
Now, I want you to take a look at this clip, because here's where it got really heated, where Fauci was indignant. Watch this.
How you can say that is not gain of function?
It is not.
It's a dance, and you're dancing around this because you're trying to obscure responsibility for 4 million people dying around the world from a pandemic.
And let's send Dr. Fauci.
I have to, well, now you're getting into something. If the point that you are making is that the grant that was funded as a sub-award from EcoHealth to Wuhan created SARS-CoV-2, that's where you are getting. Let me finish.
We don't know.
Well,
we don't
wait
know
a minute.
if it did come from the lab, but all the evidence is pointing that it came from the lab, and there will be responsibility for those who funded the lab, including yourself.
I totally
This committee
resent,
will allow the witness to respond.
I totally resent the lie that you are now propagating, Senator, because if you look at the viruses that were used in the experiments, that were given in the annual reports, that were published in the literature, it is molecularly impossible.
No one's saying those viruses caused it. No one is alleging that those viruses caused the pandemic. What we're alleging is that gain-of-function research was going on in that lab, and NIH funded it.
Your reaction?
Okay, it's interesting here. So here, what you have is Dr. Paul saying, look, this research was dangerous, and it may be the case that the lab, the Wuhan lab, which was funded by the NIH, by the way, indirectly through EcoHealth lines. There's no dispute about that. And in particular for this sort of line of work, it may be the case that the lab leaked this virus by accident. That this sort of like support for the lab actually led through some indirect mechanism, or some mechanism we don't have any visibility on at this point, to the virus that has infected, that killed millions and millions of people around the world. That's what he's saying, right? He's saying, look, that there was this support for the lab by the NIH where this accident may have happened, right? That's in effect what he's saying. Right. Fauci takes that, what Paul's trying to say, and he says, look, this particular paper isn't the paper that is the smoking gun that says this research published here in the literature is SARS-CoV-2 virus. I mean, Fauci's right about that, but you can see he's moved the ground of what Paul is actually saying in order to be able to say that Paul is lying.
So it's a semantic problem that we're dealing with, really.
Well, it's a debater's trick, right? A debater, if you have a weak point, what you do is you move the ground to you pretend like your opponent made a weak point when in fact they made a strong point, and kill the weak point, right? He's saying, look, the virus that this paper discusses, that was obviously funded by the NIH and proved by Fauci, isn't the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Well, okay, that's true, but not what Paul was saying.
Mm-hmm. So should people be held responsible for this? And what was Paul ultimately leading to? Does he want to see Fauci in jail?
I think Paul thinks that Fauci lied about the funding of the Wuhan lab in his appearance in May, and I think that has him incensed. And I think Paul wants Fauci to take responsibility for the decision to continue NIH support for gain-of-function research. Even though there was a pause from 2014 or 2015, I forget the exact date, to 2017, and then this process that was put in place that required Fauci to sign off on all this research. Actually, I checked the NIH reporter. I think something like, if you do a search on coronavirus and gain of function since 2017, there's been at least 20 large grants funded by the NIH, all of which had to have been approved through this process that Dr. Fauci had to have signed off on, I think. In any case, the point is that I think what Paul is saying is that this research was exceptionally dangerous, Dr. Fauci signed off on it. Dr. Fauci should have, he can make an intellectual defense that it was worth taking the risk. In fact, I've seen him make that defense from clips from 2013 and earlier. That's the debate, the honest debate that should be happening. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was wondering what your thoughts are about the idea that what's most troubling to a lot of people here is that the United States money was going to this particular government, which is up to no good in many, many other respects. And are they, in fact, perhaps trying to weaponize this virus? Certainly, they haven't done away with biological research, the weaponization of biological tools, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly some element of worry about China's position in this geopolitics and so on underlying this. But I think a lot of the cooperation between this Chinese lab and American authorities essentially stem from an era where there was much more trust between China and the United States than there is now. And a lot of those decisions were made in light of that trust. And Fauci could make that argument again. I think it's politically inconvenient now, and maybe it wasn't wise. Maybe we should have asked Dr. Fauci to worry more about that. But I think the whole thing in some sense is unfortunate, right? If I'm trying to look at this with the most charitable lens, Dr. Fauci is making decisions that he deemed were at the time were responsible ones. He was trying to fund research with safeguards around it to try to get ahead of any potential pandemic that could happen, or a potential pandemic that could happen with this virus.
And yes, go ahead. Finish your thought.
I mean, in retrospect, it turned out to be may have turned out to be a bad bet. If it in fact was a lab leak, which we don't yet know. And so he's trying to disclaim responsibility for a bet essentially that he made that this was the right thing to do, and ex post it turned out not to be. And Paul is saying, look, you should be held responsible for making the wrong bet. I mean, you can see it's not a question of lying one way or the other. It's a question of judgment. And Paul is saying you had the wrong judgment. And Fauci, instead of arguing that, look, this was reasonable at the time, is accusing Paul of lying. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. It really looks like he's trying to cover up around the decisions he made, rather than trying to justify them from intellectually.
Mm-hmm. Following up on that, China has now said that it's rejected a new COVID investigation. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it's irresponsible. I think China has absolute responsibility. I mean, it's very clear that the virus originated in China. It's not clear as yet if it was a lab leak, but it could be. It certainly looks like it's quite possible it was a lab leak. It also looks like it's possible that it was the virus itself was as a result of gain of function research. I mean, we don't know this, but it absolutely deserves looking into, and it is irresponsible for China to not cooperate with the international community in investigating this.
What are your thoughts about the new variant, the Delta variant, which is taking hold across the country, across the world in many respects? You said earlier, I know that these vaccines were very, very effective. It seems to me, from what we're reading from the literature, they're not so effective, really, except in reducing perhaps the severity of symptoms.
But that's the crucial thing. The crucial thing is the severity. And the vaccines are still, I think, quite effective at reducing the severity. In fact, if you look at the data out of Sweden, out of the UK, and now out of the United States, the states that now have these rising cases, you're seeing cases rise, but you're not seeing deaths rise. Mm-hmm. And the reason is very simple. It's the vaccine and prior immunity for prior infections have made a large part of the previously vulnerable part of the population, the older population, they've turned the disease that would have been this deadly thing that would cause hospitalizations and deaths into something much less severe. And so you have this decoupling of cases and deaths, so that the cases are rising, but the deaths are flat. I actually think in many ways I mean, I don't want to sound be overly Pollyannish, but it feels like it's gutted the epidemic. It's really no longer a state of emergency. It's something that we should work at. It's a health problem, but it's not something that warrants a state of emergency anymore, because the vaccine has been so effective at protecting the vulnerable.
Psychology, sociology, the poets have for millennia talked about the need for fear in human culture, in human society. We all have boogeymen. Children's books are written about monsters and stuff, as if it's a necessary component of human existence. Is that why we reacted to the COVID virus the way we did, the way the world did? Or was it a legitimate fear?
I think for the population at large, especially in the developed world, we had thought that we had conquered infectious disease. It was a remote thing in our lives. We were worried about cancer, heart disease, and if we thought about mortality at all, those were the kinds of things we worried about. We didn't think that infectious disease could still be something that would harm us. And I think that primal fear of infectious disease, I think, certainly explains part of the fear. I think governments also played a role. Like the UK government in particular, for instance, actually put out a policy of creating panic and fear. There was a New York Times op-ed written during I think last year in the summer, saying that people should be scared of the virus. I think that the problem there is that if you use panic as a public health tool, it's hard to unring the bell, even when the news is good, and you make bad decisions as a consequence. You ignore costs from lockdowns is a good example of because if your mind is focused on this one thing, well, you forget about all these other dangers that still lurk in society, right? You still need to worry about heart disease. You still do need to worry about psychological, depression. You still need to worry about all these other things but you're only focused on one thing because it's fear.
Yeah, I would imagine for expressing that view and many others, you have taken a tremendous amount of flack. Have you?
Yeah, I mean, it's not been the easiest time. I mean, I have a job, and it's my responsibility to speak up, even if it's unpopular.
Well, we appreciate your opinion, your perspective, Dr. J. Bhattacharya from Stanford University. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Doug.